Hello, and welcome back. We continue now the dramatic reading of His Majesty's Dragon, Book 1 of the Temeraire novel series by the one, the only Naomi Novik. And we're picking up mid-chapter here. Where did I leave you? Oh, they were going off to sleep, right? So this is the next morning on the eve of battle. Admiral Lenton received the dispatches and the verbal message with frowning concern. "I do not like it in the least, not in the least," he said. "Working inland, is he? Lawrence, could he be building more boats on shore, planning to add to his fleet without our knowing?" "Some awkward transports he might perhaps be able to make, sir, but never ships of the line," Lawrence said at once, with perfect certainty on the subject. "And he already has a great many transports, in every port, along the coastline. It is difficult to conceive that he might require more." "And all this around Cherbourg, not Calais, though the distance is greater, and our fleet is closer by. I cannot account for it. But Gardner is quite right. I'm damned sure he means mischief, and he cannot very well do it until his fleet is here." Abruptly he stood and walked straight from the office. Unsure whether to take this as a dismissal, Lawrence followed him through the headquarters and outside, to the clearing where Lily was lying in her recovery. Remember, Lily took some serious battle damage. She's a major target on the battlefield. She's the Long Wing, one of the most devastating, deadly dragons they have, but also lightweight, small of body, so delicate, if relatively speaking. Captain Harcourt was sitting by Lily's head, stroking her foreleg over and over. Choiseul was with her and reading quietly to them both. Lily's eyes were still dull with pain, but in a more encouraging sign she had evidently just eaten whole food at last, for there was a great heap of cracked bones still being cleared away by the ground crew. Choiseul put down his book and said a quiet word to Harcourt, then came to them. "She is almost asleep. I beg you do not stir her," he said very softly. Lenton nodded and beckoned him and Lawrence both further away. "How does she progress?" he asked. "Very well, sir, according to the surgeons. They say she heals as quickly as could be hoped," Choiseul said. "Catherine has not left her side." Good, Lenton said. 3 weeks, then, if their original estimate holds true. Well, gentlemen, I've changed my mind. I'm going to send Temeraire out on patrol every day during her recovery, rather than giving him and Precursor turn and turn about. You do not need the experience, Choiseul, and Temeraire does. You will have to keep Precursor exercised independently." Choiseul bowed, with no hint of dissatisfaction, if he felt any. "I am happy to serve in any way that I can, sir. You need merely direct me." Lenton nodded. "Well, and for now, stay with Harcourt as much as ever you can. I'm sure you know what it is to have a wounded beast," he said. Choiseul rejoined her by the now sleeping Lily, and Lenton led Lawrence away again, scowling in private thought. "Lawrence," he said, "while you patrol, I want you to try and run formation maneuvers with Nitidus and Dulcia. I know you've not trained to small formation work, but Warren and Chenery can help you there. I want him to be able to lead a pair of light combatants in a fight independently, if need be." "Very good, sir," Lawrence said, a little startled. He wanted badly to ask for some explanation, and repressed his curiosity with some difficulty. They came to the clearing where Excidium was just falling asleep. Captain Roland was speaking with her ground crewman and inspecting a piece of the harness. She nodded to them both and came away with them. They walked back towards the headquarters. "Roland, can you do without Octoritas and Crescendium?" Lenton asked abruptly. She lifted an eyebrow at him. "If I have to, of course," she said. "What's this about?" Lenton did not seem to object to being so directly queried. "We must begin to think about sending Excidium to Cadiz, once Lily is flying well," he said. "I'm not going to have the kingdom lost for want of one dragon in the right place. We can hold out against aerial raids a long time here, with the help of the Channel Fleet and the shore batteries, and that fleet must not be allowed to escape." If Lenton did choose to send Excidium and his formation away, their absence would leave the channel vulnerable to aerial attack. Yet, if the French and Spanish fleet escaped Cadiz and came north to join the ships in port at Brest and Calais, Perhaps even a single day or so, overwhelming an advantage, would be enough for Napoleon to ferry over his invasion force. Sorry for the trips here, I'm going to warm it up. Lawrence did not envy Lenton the decision. Without knowing whether Bonaparte's aerial divisions were halfway to Cadiz overland or still along the Austrian border, the choice could only be half-guess. Yet it would have to be made, if only through inaction, and Lenton was clearly prepared instead to take the risk. Now Lenton's design with regard to Temeraire's orders was clear. The admiral wanted the flexibility of having a second formation on hand, even if a small and imperfectly trained one. So Temeraire's going to have his own little squad, potentially, so he could defend in a couple different directions or a couple different attacks. Lawrence thought that he recalled that Auctoritas and Crescendium were middleweight combat dragons, part of Excidium's supporting forces. Perhaps Lenton intended to match them with Temeraire, to make a maneuverable strike force of the three of them. "Trying to outguess Bonaparte. The thought makes my blood run cold," Captain Roland said, echoing Lawrence's sentiments. "But we will be ready to go whenever you want to send us. I will fly maneuvers without Octor and Cressy as time allows." "Good. See to it," Lenton said as they climbed the stairs to the foyer. "I will leave you now. I have another 10 dispatches to read yet. More's the pity. Good night, gentlemen." "Good night, Lenton," Roland said, and stretched out with a yawn when he was gone. "Ah, well, formation flying would be deadly boring without a change about every so often, any road. What do you say to some supper?" They had some soup and toasted bread, and a nice Stilton after, with port, and once again settled in Roland's room for some quiet piquet. After a few hands and some idle conversation, she said, with the first note of diffidence he had ever heard from her, "Lawrence, may I make so bold?" The question made him stare, as she had never before hesitated to forge ahead on any subject whatsoever. "Certainly," he said, trying to imagine what she could possibly mean to ask him. Abruptly he was aware of his surroundings, the large and rumpled bed, less than 10 steps away, the open throat of her dressing gown, for which she had exchanged her coat and breeches, behind a screen, which she had exchanged behind a screen when they first came into the room. He looked down at his cards, his face heating. His hands trembled a little. "If you have any reluctance, I beg you tell me at once," she added. "No," Lawrence said at once. "I would be happy to oblige you, I'm sure," he added belatedly, as he realized she had not yet asked. "You are very kind," she said, and a wide flash of a smile crossed her face, lopsidedly, the right side of her mouth turning up more than the scarred left. Then she went on, "And I would be very grateful if you would tell me, with real honesty, what you think of Emily's work, and her inclination for the life." He was hard-pressed not to turn crimson at his mistaken assumption, maybe ours as well, even as she added, "I know it is a wretched thing to ask you to speak ill of her to me, but I have seen what comes of relying too heavily upon the line of succession, without good training. If you have any cause to doubt her suitability, I beg you to tell me now, while there still may be time to repair the fault." Her anxiety was very plain now, and thinking of Rankin and his disgraceful treatment of Levitas, Lawrence could well understand it. Remember, Rankin was a second-generation captain. It's nothing like his grandfather, I believe. Sympathy enabled him to recover from his self-inflicted embarrassment. "I've seen the consequences of what you describe as well," he said, quick to reassure her. "I promise you I would speak frankly if I saw any such signs. Indeed, I should never have taken her on as a runner if I were not entirely convinced of her reliability, and her dedication to her duty. She is too young for certainty, of course, but I think her very promising." Roland blew out a breath gustily and sat back in her chair, letting her hand of cards drop as she stopped even pretending to be paying them attention. "Lord, how you relieve me," she said. "I hoped, of course, but I find I cannot trust myself on the subject." She laughed with relief and went to her bureau for a new bottle of wine. Lawrence held out his glass for her to fill. "To Emily's success," he proposed, and they drank. And then she reached out, took the glass from his hand, and kissed him. He had indeed been wholly mistaken on this matter. She proved not at all tentative. Whoa, got a little steamy there at the end of chapter 10. And since that was just the tail end of a chapter, I can't honestly leave you now. Let us continue on to chapter 11. Lawrence could not help wincing at the haphazard way in which Jane threw her things out of the wardrobe and into heaps upon the bed. "May I help you?" he asked finally, out of desperation, and took possession of her baggage. "No, I beg you, permit me this liberty. You may consider your flight path as I do this," he said. "Thank you, Lawrence, that is very kind of you." She sat down with her maps instead. "It will be a straightforward flight, I hope," she went on, scribbling calculations and moving the small bits of wood which she was using to represent the scattered dragon transports that would provide Excidium and his formation with the resting places on their way to Cadiz. "So long as the weather holds, less than 2 weeks should see us there." With so much urgent need, the dragons would not be going by a single transport, but rather would fly from one transport to another, attempting to predict their locations based on the current wind. Lawrence nodded, though a little grimly. They were only a day shy of October, and there was every likelihood at this time of year that the weather would not hold. I mean, just think about that. With this fanciful addition of aerial combat and aerial divisions into military, they have to do it without radios. They have to do it without radar or anything like that, or even ships that can power themselves without wind. So it's a totally different proposition, a much riskier proposition to be traveling at distance and try to meet up with ships out at sea, which could be not where you think at all, based on whatever the wind or lack thereof, and lack of general communication to the outside world. Lawrence nodded, though a little grimly. They were only days shy of October, and we're back. Then she would be faced with the dangerous choice of trying to find a transport that might easily have been blown off course, or seeking shelter inland in the face of Spanish artillery. Well, there you go. Presuming, of course, that the formation was not itself brought down by a storm. Dragons were, from time to time, cast down by lightning or heavy winds, and if flung into a heavy ocean, they could easily drown with all their crew. But there was no choice. Lily had recovered with great speed over the intervening weeks. She had led the formation through a full patrol only yesterday, and landed without pain or stiffness. Lenton had looked her over, spoken a few words with her and Captain Harcourt, and gone straight away to give Jane her orders for Cadiz. Lawrence had been expecting as much, of course, but he could not help but feeling concern, both for the dragons going and for those remaining behind. "There, that will do," she said, finishing her chart and throwing down her pen. She looked up from the baggage in surprise. He had fallen into a brown study and packed mechanically, without marking what he did. Now he realized that he had been silent for nearly 20 minutes together, and that he had one of her stays in his hands. He hastily dropped it atop and neatly packed things in her small case and closed the lid. The sunlight was beginning to come in at the windows. Their time was gone. "There, Lawrence, do not look so glum. I have made the flight to Gibraltar 12 times," she said, coming to kiss him soundly. "You will have a worse time of it here, I'm afraid. They will undoubtedly try some mischief once they know we are gone." "I have every confidence in you," Lawrence said, ringing the bell for the servants. "I only hope we have not misjudged." It was as much as he would say critical of Lenton, particularly on a subject where he could not be unbiased. He felt that even if he had not had a personal objection to make to placing to Excidium and his formation in danger, he would still have been concerned by the lack of further intelligence. Volley had arrived 3 days before with a full report of fresh negatives. A handful of French dragons had arrived in Cadiz, enough to keep Mortiferous from forcing out the fleet, but not a tenth of the dragons which had been stationed along the Rhine. And in cause for more concern, even though nearly every light and quick dragon not wholly involved in dispatch service had been pressed into scouting and spying, they still knew nothing more of Bonaparte's work across the Channel. Those boats he's been building, inland as well. He walked with her to Excidium's clearing and saw her aboard. It was strange, for he felt as though he ought to feel more. He would have put a bullet in his brain sooner than let Edith go to face danger, while he remained behind himself. Edith, remember, was his sort of first serious girlfriend, perhaps soon-to-be fiancée, but had to part because of the whole dragon thing coming in, right? Yet he could say his adieus to Roland without much more of a pang. than in bidding farewell to another comrade. She blew him a friendly kiss from atop Excidium's back once her crew were all aboard. "I will see you in a few months, I am sure, or sooner, if we chase the frogs out of the harbor," she called down. "Fair winds, and mind you, don't let Emily run wild." He raised a hand to her. "Godspeed," he called, and stood watching as the enormous wings carried Excidium up, the other dragons of his formation rising to join him, until they all had dwindled out of sight to the south. Although they kept a wary eye on the Channel skies, the first weeks after Excidium's departure were quiet. No raids came, and Lenton was of the opinion that the French still thought Excidium was in residence, and were correspondently reluctant to make any venture. "The longer we keep them thinking of it, the better," he said to the assembled captains after another uneventful patrol. "Aside from the benefit to us, just as well if they don't realize another formation is nearing their precious fleet at Cadiz." They took a great measure of comfort from the news of Excidium's safe arrival, which Volley had brought almost 2 weeks to the day from his departure. "They'd already begun when I left," Captain James told the other captains the next day. "They'd already begun when I left," Captain James told the other captains the next day, taking a hurried breakfast before setting out on his return journey. "You could hear the Spaniards howling for miles. Their merchantmen are as quick to fall apart under dragon spray as any ship of the line, and their shops and houses as well. I expect they'll fire on the Frenchmen themselves if Villeneuve doesn't come out soon, alliance or not." The atmosphere grew lighter after this encouraging news. And by the way, even though dragons weren't involved, I do believe this part of the story Naomi Novik has kept accurate, that the French fleet was penned up in Cadiz after being chased back all the way across the Atlantic and back by the British fleet. So the French and the Spanish fleet were penned up. So this far, aside from dragons being involved, they've kept accurate, which is cool. It makes it feel more real to the history buffs among us who follow this type of thing. The atmosphere grew lighter. Lenton cut their patrol a little short and granted them all liberty for celebration, a welcome respite to men who had been working at a frenetic pace. The more energetic went into town. Most seized a little sleep, as did the weary dragons. Lawrence took the opportunity to enjoy a quiet evening's reading with Temeraire. They stayed together late into the night, reading by the light of the lanterns. Lawrence woke out of a light doze some time after the moon had risen. Temeraire's head was dark against the illuminated sky, and he was looking searchingly to the north of their clearing. "Is something the matter?" Lawrence asked him, sitting up. He could hear a faint noise, strange and high. Even as they listened, the sound stopped. "Lawrence, that was Lily, I think," Temeraire said, his ruff standing up stiffly. Lawrence slid down at once. "Stay here. I will return as quickly as I may," he said, and Temeraire nodded without ever looking away. So Temeraire knows something's wrong. The paths through the covert were largely deserted and unlit. Excidium's formation gone, all the light dragons out on scouting duty, and the night cold enough to send even the most dedicated crews into the barracks buildings. The ground had frozen 3 days before. It was packed and hard enough for his heels to drum hollowly upon it as he walked. Lily's clearing was empty. A faint murmur of noise from the barracks, whose lit windows he could see distantly through the trees, and no one about the buildings. Lily herself was crouched, motionless, her yellow eyes red-rimmed and staring, and she was clawing the ground silently. Low voices, and the sound of crying? Lawrence wondered if he was intruding untimely, but Lily's evident distress decided him. He walked into the clearing, calling in a strong voice, "Harcourt, are you there?" "No further," came Choisill's voice, low and sharp. Lawrence came around Lily's head and halted in dreadful surprise. Choisill was holding Harcourt by the arm, and there was an expression of complete despair on his face. "Make no sound, Lawrence," he said. There was a sword in his hand, and behind him on the ground Lawrence could see a young midwingman stretched out, dark bloodstains spreading over the back of his coat. "No sound at all." "For God's sake, what do you think you are about?" Lawrence said. "Harcourt, is it well with you?" "He has killed Wilpoys," she said thickly. She was wavering where she stood, and as the torchlight came on her face, he could see a bruise already darkening half across her forehead. "Lawrence, never mind about me. You must go and fetch help. He means to do Lily a mischief. No, never, never, Choiseul said. I mean no harm to her or to you, Catherine, I swear it. But I will not be answerable if you interfere, Lawrence. Do nothing. He raised the sword. Blood gleamed on its edge, not far from Harcourt's neck. And Lily made a thin, eerie noise. Again, a high-pitched whining that grated against the ear. Choiseul was pale, his face taking on a greenish cast in the light, and he looked desperate enough to do anything. Lawrence kept his position, hoping for a better moment. Choiseul stood staring at him a moment longer until satisfied Lawrence did not mean to go, and then said, We will go, all of us, to Precursorus. Lily, you will stay here, and follow when you see us go aloft. I promise you no harm will come to Catherine, so long as you obey. Oh, you miserable, cow-hearted traitor dog, Harcourt said. Do you think I'm going to go to France with you and lick Bonaparte's boots? How long have you been planning this? She struggled to pull away from him, even staggering as she was, but Choiseul shook her, and she nearly fell. Lily snarled, half rising, her wings mantling. Lawrence could see the black acid glistening at the edge of her bone spurs. Catherine, she hissed, the sound distorted through her clenched teeth. Silence. Enough, Choiseul said, pulling Harcourt up and close to his body, pinning her arms, the sword still held steadily in his other hand, Lawrence's eyes always upon it, waiting for a chance. You will follow, Lily. You will do as I have said. We are going now. March, at once. Monsieur, there. He gestured with the sword. Lawrence did not turn around, but stepped backwards, and once beneath the shadow of the trees, he moved more slowly still, so that Choiseul came unknowingly closer than he meant to do. A moment of wild grappling, then they all three went to the ground in a heap, the sword flying and Harcourt caught between them. They struck the ground heavily, but Choiseul was beneath, and for a moment Lawrence had the advantage. He was forced to sacrifice it to roll Harcourt free and out of harm's way. Choiseul struck himself across the face as soon as she was clear. Choiseul struck him across the face as soon as she was clear, throwing him off. They rolled about on the ground, battering at each other awkwardly, both trying to reach for the sword, even as they struggled. Choiseul was powerfully built and taller, and though Lawrence had a far greater experience in close combat, the Frenchman's weight began to tell as they wrestled. Lily was roaring out loud now, voices calling in the distance, and despair gave Choiseul a burst of strength. He drove a fist into Lawrence's stomach and lunged for the sword while Lawrence curled, gasping about the pain. Then there was a tremendous roaring above them. The ground shuddered, branches tumbling down in a rain of dry leaves and pine needles, and an immense old tree was wrenched whole out of the ground beside them. Temeraire was above them, beating wildly as he tore away the cover. More bellowing. Now from Precursorus, the French dragon's pale marbled wings were visible in the dark, approaching, and Temeraire writhed about to face him, claws stretching out. Lawrence dragged himself up and threw himself into Choiseul, bearing him down to the ground with all of his weight. He was retching even as they struggled, but Temeraire's danger spurred him on. Choiseul managed to turn them over and force an arm against Lawrence's throat, pressing hard, choking. Lawrence caught only a glimpse of motion, and then Choiseul went limp. Harcourt had fetched an iron bar from Lily's gear and struck him upon the back of the head. She was nearly fainting with the effort, Lily trying to crowd between the trees to reach her. The crew were rushing into the clearing now at last, however, and many hands helped Lawrence to his feet. Stand over there, man, and stand over that man there. Bring torches, Lawrence said, gasping. And get a full-voiced man here with a speaking trumpet. Hurry, damn you! From above, Temeraire and Precursorus were still circling each other, claws flashing. Harcourt's first lieutenant was a big-chested man with a voice that needed no trumpet. As soon as he understood the circumstances, he cupped his hands around his mouth and bellowed up at Precursorus. The big French dragon broke off and flew in wild, desperate circles for a moment as he peered down to where Choiseul was being secured. And then, with drooping head, he returned to the ground, Temeraire hovering watchfully until he had landed. Maximus was housed not far off, and Berkeley had come to the clearing on hearing the noise. He took charge now, settling men to chain Precursorus, and others to bear Harcourt and Choiseul to the surgeons, still others to take away poor Wilpoys to be buried. "No, thank you, I can manage," Lawrence said, shaking off the willing hands that would have carried him as well. His breath was returning, and he walked slowly over to the clearing where Temeraire had landed beside Lily to comfort both the dragons and try to calm them. Wow, unexpected attack, unexpected treachery from Choiseul there, and I'm going to pause there in a good ways into chapter 11, and we will pick back up to find out the justice that'll be meted out upon Choiseul, and what does this why did Choiseul choose now to betray and try to take Lily away? Is this triggering something to come? Stick with us. We'll see you on the next one.